this is an exciting day. Two of my absolute favorite women in the world are joining us. Two women from the fire service who are coming at it from different perspectives, but I suspect we'll hear a lot of similarities as well. So we're joined today by Oakville Deputy Fire Chief Monique Belair. She is just a trailblazer and someone that I've had the pleasure of working with here in my riding of Oakville, North Burlington, and in Oakville. And also Michelle Vandevord, who is a captain and volunteer firefighter with the Musqueam First Nation. She's also the Associate Director of the Saskatchewan First Nations Emergency Management Association. Two amazing women. Thank you for joining me. And I'll maybe also just recognize that I'm today on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation here in my riding of Oakville, North Burlington. And maybe, Michelle, we'll start with you. Tell us a little bit about what you do and what brought you into the fire service.
Good morning, Pam. Again, it's nice to meet everybody. I'm also very excited. So back 22 years ago, it was actually just a shoulder tap from a friend who looked at me. His name is actually Randy Bear, who we recently lost. So he said, come out to the fire department, come to a meeting. And that was 22 years ago, and I haven't looked back since. And for the past 4 years, I have been first started off as an officer with Saskatchewan First Nation Emergency Management. And now I am currently the associate director. And what our organization does is we deliver emergency and fire services on reserve all over Saskatchewan to our First Nation communities for free. And I'm also right now currently the sitting president of the Aboriginal Firefighters Association of Canada. That's another thing I'm really proud of, the very first female to ever sit on the board and the first female sitting president as well. So
and you just did a report on the challenges in First Nations community during COVID with fire, right?
It has been very challenging. So the Aboriginal Firefighters Association of Canada is rolling out the National Indigenous Fire Safety Council project. And what that program is doing is bringing all of those fire services programs nationally to our First Nation communities. So it's very exciting. The report, we actually just rolled out a report on morbidity and mortality, which if you have a chance to read it, it's got some, nobody's been recording stats on reserve and fire deaths and injuries. So it's a very good report. And it shows the gaps that we have on reserve and fire services and, First Nations people being 10 times more likely to be hurt or killed in a house fire. So with the programs rolling out nationally, we are going to reduce those numbers significantly.
That's terrific. That's really great. And Monique, I know you have an interesting story as well about how you ended up in the fire service. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about that and what you're doing now.
Sure. I started in 1986 with the Canadian Armed Forces as a crash rescue structural firefighter. I had gone to college here in Niagara and wanted to be a police officer. But at the time when I graduated, I was too young. So I thought I'd be military police officer with the Canadian Armed Forces. And lo and behold, they thought I was more suited for the fire service, not something I had ever really considered. As you know, it's still not something really widely promoted for females, even 36 years later. We're still struggling with that. So I've had a great career. I have been worked in every facet of the fire service. So I've been in communications, fire investigations, public education, fire inspections, communications, fire marshal's office for 7 years. And for the past 7 years, I've been a deputy fire chief. And I always knew right from the beginning, because of some of the obstacles I felt as a female that I experienced at the beginning of my career, that in order to make change, I needed to understand the role of women in all aspects of the fire service, then eventually get into a senior management role where I could start encouraging and implementing some kind of change and providing a more inclusive environment for women that would help entertain the idea with our young females about wanting to pursue a career in the fire service, because I think there's a real lack of knowledge about the options that the fire service provides to women.
And if I remember correctly, they sent you over to the fire service because you were tall. Is that
That's
right?
right. That's correct. At the time, the Canadian Armed Forces was promoting women in non-traditional trades. And I can remember being at the Career Center thinking I'm going for military police, and at least 2 or 3 times the recruiter came out and kept asking me what my height was, and actually literally measuring me at the recruiting office, saying, okay, yep, we're confirming you're 5'9". Okay, yep, you're 5'9". And I kept wondering, why do they care how tall I am to be a police officer? And it was that at the time, believe it or not, there used to be a height restriction to be a firefighter, and you had to be a minimum of 5'8" to be a firefighter. So they were just trying to confirm that I was actually, quote, tall enough to do the job.
Well, we're glad that they did, because it's been, it's funny how life takes you sometimes, that it may not be the first direction you want to go in, but you end up in a place where you were meant to be. Michelle, what are some of the challenges you faced in your career?
It's a little bit different in the volunteer sector, right? So when I first joined, my uncle was actually the fire chief. So I wasn't expecting too much pushback. I knew there would be some, because at the time there was no females on the department. And in my very first meeting, I was kind of singled out, and it's like, well, boys, now you're going to have to start shutting the bathroom door. And I just, I felt really singled out. And really having to prove myself over and over and over again, right? It's like, I think everybody thought that I was just there. It was going to be something that I checked out for a little while and then quit, because I think many females had come before me. And, after a couple of years, and you stick with it, and you just have to work harder. I think that's the biggest challenge I've had, is constantly having to prove myself over and over and over again, even though, you become a part of a team, but you're always looked at differently.
And then you face different challenges as a First Nations firefighter as well. I know when we were studying post-traumatic stress injuries at the Public Safety Committee, that was one of the things we talked about was, because you're in a small community, everybody. And so when you're responding to calls, it tends to be at places where the family. It could be a relative, a close friend. So some of the challenges from a mental health perspective are different, but also you were talking about the 10 times more likely to die in a fire if you're on reserve. You've got issues with housing, you've got issues with, maybe you could talk a little bit about just the general challenges on reserve.
So every time we're toned out to a call, like you said, that you're going to know the person that you're going to a call to. And it is very traumatic. It's very hard. You have to have a really tight team as well. And one way I think that we mitigate that on reserve, just speaking of my own fire department, is being very, very, how do I say this? We do a lot of pub ed. We're very active in our community. We do home inspections every year with our volunteer fire department. So it's being proactive instead of reactive all the time on the reserve. Doing the pub ed in the schools, making sure all the kids know how to do the home escape plans is so important. And there's another opportunity when I'm in the schools and I'm in my turnout gear and my uniforms, and I see those little girls and their faces lighting up. That's how I'm reaching out to the females all the time, right? Being in my community and going to a scene or at a house fire, I see those little girls standing around and looking at me, and they see a little, some long hair underneath that helmet, and it's like, wow, right? So
That's
and
great.
the challenges are hard though. It's the hard calls, right? Like, you don't really get over them, and being family and close in the community makes it so much harder. And I think that's why we have a really hard time with recruitment on reserve, is that's what stops people, right? It's like they can't see themselves being able to do that kind of work. So how I try and go about that differently is, because there's so many different jobs in the fire service, right? You don't have to be right in there and at the truck and in the house. We need people to help with crowd control and taking care of other family members. So there's so many other jobs rather than always, putting the white stuff on the red stuff. So.
Well, and I've heard Monique say that many times as well. It's not just putting wet on hot, I think is the way I've heard you say it, Monique.
Yep.
What kind of challenges have you faced in your career?
So I think I would say being one of the first 5 females in Canada that was a firefighter with the Canadian Armed Forces. What was unique about the Canadian Forces, not only just being a female, is that it's a very sought after trade in the armed forces. It's almost like you do 10 years with the infantry or the RCRs or PPCLI or the airborne, and to reward you, it's called a remuster, and then you remuster into the fire trade. And it's like a reward for your years of doing combat. I was a direct entry. I was 19 years of age, if you can imagine. So not only did I have the stigma of being a very young female in a fire hall, I was also working with the mindset of military soldiers that felt they had earned it, and that, how come she at 19 gets it and I don't? So I'll be honest, I had some wonderful people that I worked with on my shift, and I had obviously not some wonderful people. But, you always have to look at what's on your plate, why you're being challenged, and how you're going to address it, and how are you going to do change. For me, it's all about change and making it better. And it wasn't just males that gave me a hard time back in the 80s. There were a lot of females. So you can imagine I was stationed in Ottawa. So I did a lot of public relations for the government regarding women in non-traditional trades. And a lot of times when I would be interviewed on TV or in the newspaper or on a radio show, a lot of the callers were females. And a lot of them were the ones that were negative. You're not strong enough. You're sleeping in the station with the men. The number one question I used to get asked, honestly, believe it or not, was, where do I sleep and what do I wear? Like, number one question, not what are the challenges of the job, or, how do you handle the stress of the job? Nothing. It was all about my sleeping accommodations, which was really sad and was a real eye-opener. But in that respect, like I said, I had some absolutely phenomenal support. And for an example, curling bond spills used to be really big in the fire service. And I remember Ottawa Fire was hosting it one year. And I had finished my day shift and I was heading over to the meet and greet. And there would have been easily 400 or 500 people in this room. They were all men. I was the only female firefighter at this time. I opened the door, and no word of a lie, you could just see the silence just travel across the room. And the shock that a woman had just walked into this totally male meet and greet. And I heard someone yell out to my fire chief, "Oh yeah, chief, I heard you had a skirt working for you." And there was just death silence. And my fire chief of the day, I never forget this, word for word, he said, "I don't have any skirts working for me. I only have firefighters. And if that's your attitude, you need to leave." I will never forget that. So those moments are the moments I try and really focus on, is the ones that were supportive. Some people's attitudes, Pam, you're just never going to change. No matter how hard we work, you're just hitting your head against a dead wall. And you know what? They're the dinosaurs. They're going to have to move on sooner or later, because that's not the environment that all departments, I would say, are really pushing for a more inclusive, for whether it's your gender, your race, your culture, your religion. It's about, inclusivity.
Well, and it makes for a better organization when you do have a more diverse workforce, right? I mean, I know, Michelle, you mentioned how you would go into schools and you go into the community and little girls look at the long hair under the helmet, right? Maybe that's why you've grown your hair longer, Monique, so that they can see the long hair under the helmet. But what kind of things, I mean, for you to be the first female president of the Aboriginal Firefighters Association, that gives you a platform across the country for young women and girls, because I have to say, when I went to the fire chiefs annual meeting in Ottawa, they have a lobby day and then they have a reception. And I walked into the room and I looked around and I remember saying, there's no women in the room. And then I finally found one. She's a volunteer chief in, I think it was Canmore. Now that's changed since then. This would have been 2016, but it's still, the number of women in the fire service is still incredibly, incredibly low. Michelle, what kind of things are you doing to try and encourage more young women to follow in your footsteps?
A lot of it, well, in region in Saskatchewan, last year was the very first time we had a female team compete for the First Nation National Firefighting Competition. So that was huge. And it really started just with one First Nation community going out and doing some mentoring. You know, this is what I do. And, you know, even older women, right? My own age, a little bit younger, and they're looking at me and it's like, wow, that is so cool. You're a firefighter. And it's like, yeah. And like, how do you do it? And you have all these questions, right? And you be yourself, you work hard, you care about your community. Like, and that's what we do as women. We have that nurturing, caring. So when it comes to taking care of your community in the fire service, I said, isn't that just natural? Right. And it clicks right away with females, right? It's like, yeah, I can do that. You know, and I've even had girls come up and say, well, I can't do that. And it's just talking about those other roles in the fire department. It's not all about being able to operate those complicated looking big fire trucks. It's about caring about people, right? It's the first responder side. There's so many different facets, but I think one of the main things I do is be myself. You know, I don't really focus on all of the challenges I've had because I think of it as breaking glass ceilings, right? So the females coming up after me don't have to go through that. And like Monique said, you know, there's always going to be those people in there discouraging and not wanting to see it happen. But the more ceilings that get broke, the less harder the other females have to fight.
That's amazing. And Monique, I know you've been really passionate about engaging young women in our community, and you started Camp Molly, which is so cool. And it's something that I'm so proud of that you've been able to do, and to see the young women. I will never ever forget visiting a couple years ago, and one of the young women, Abigail, that was part of it, had been part of my Young Women in Leadership program. And not she's very quiet, and came up and gave me a big hug and just thanked me. And I'll never forget that. You know, it was just so emotional for her, for me, to see this young woman being given the opportunity that you provided. So can you maybe talk about what you've done here to try and get more young women interested in the fire service?
Absolutely. So, as you know, I mentor many, many young girls. I put myself out there all the time. I sit on the board of directors for Fire Service Women of Ontario now. I do the Women in Leadership program with yourself. Any opportunity I have for speaking or be invited out as a panelist, 100%, I will always be there because it's so important to me. But as you're aware, I did your mentoring program one year. And what really got me thinking was how little things had actually changed from when I started, and how little these females between the ages of 15 and 18 think of a viable opportunity as a career in fire services. So for the example is, Pam's girl showed up a little bit late for her session, the day session with me. And I said to her, oh, she was all apologetic. And I said, don't worry. And I said, is everything okay? And she said, well, my dad didn't really want me to come. And I said, oh, did he think it was going to be too dangerous at the training campus for you? She said, no. He said, why are you wasting your time? Because women can't be firefighters. And this is just a couple of years ago. And I was like, what? She goes, yeah, in fact, when I told my dad, no, Dad, the female deputy fire chief in Oakville is a woman. He actually didn't believe his daughter and looked me up on LinkedIn and couldn't believe how long or what experience I'd had in the fire service. So it really got me thinking about the challenges these young girls have, because obviously guidance counselors are not talking to these girls about it. So I went to our senior management and said, you know, I'd really like to run a camp. And the reason it's called Camp Molly is we can trace our roots back. Molly is the first female firefighter in North America that's been recognized from 1818. So that's why we call it Camp Molly, and as a trailblazer, because we can trace our history 200 years in the fire service. So it's not something new for women. Camp Molly is a 4-day camp, and I'm so happy because today registration officially opens for Camp Molly 2021. September 23rd to the 26th. So you go on the Town of Oakville website, just type in Camp Molly and you can register. What's unique about Camp Molly is it engages the 3 other fire services. So Burlington, Milton, Halton Hills. So if you're 15 to 18 and you live in the Halton region, between those ages, you make your application online. It is cost-free. We have an overwhelming support from the community. I can't even tell you the stuff that is provided through the generosity of our local businesses and donations. And the reason we do that is we didn't want it to be cost prohibitive for any young woman to say, well, you know, I can't afford bunker gear rental, or I can't get safety boots, or I can't afford lunches, or anything like that. So everything is donated. It's all sized up. And it's just such a wonderful experience. But like you, Melissa, I want to say that what is unique is we didn't focus just on the red trucks. We didn't want it just to be a firefighting one. So we have OFM fire investigators from the province come in, and they learn all, and they conduct a fire investigation. We have public education, investigations, a communications portion, suppression portion. They learn. So if you are interested in chemistry and physics and forensics, then think about fire investigation as a potential career. If you like developing programs and engaging the public and community speaking, then, you know, public education might be the option for you. So that's what it is. It's an introduction to all levels of the fire service. So I'm very proud of it. And I'm so proud of the young ladies and my volunteers, because we get overwhelming support from volunteers as well.
Well, it's an incredible program, and I just want to thank both of you. As I said, you're 2 of my favorite people in the world. I'm just got so much respect for what you do and how you're changing the country and changing the world by what you're doing. Michelle, you're amazing. I consider it a blessing that day that you happened to be in the meeting that I was in and we were able to connect. And Monique, Oakville is so fortunate to have you in the position that you're in here, and all the young women around the world and across our country who get to see 2 smart, incredible women in the position that you're in. I love what your chief said at the time, Monique, about she's not a skirt, she's a firefighter. And you know, it's just so important. And Michelle, what you were talking about breaking glass ceilings, maybe at some point we'll stop talking about the first woman to do this and the first woman to do that, because it will just be something that happens and it doesn't actually make the news. So to both of you, my heartfelt thanks. You're incredible. And we'll include the link to Camp Molly in this when we post it, Monique, and maybe we can get Michelle involved in some way in our community, because that would be awesome. So thank you both so much.
Thank you so much, Pam. It was a pleasure to meet you.
It was a pleasure to meet you as well, and thank you so much.